Thank you very, very much, Vanaraji, and it's a real pleasure to be back here at the Mid-Essex Buddhist Centre. Last time I came, I was just so struck by the warmth of the reception from Vanaraji, but Vanaraji I knew was always warm and incredibly generous and friendly, but then I was struck that the whole Sangha was, in a way, reflected Vanaraji's warmth. And I thought that was just pretty special. I was saying earlier that Triratna is sometimes celebrated, known for its friendliness, and I think that's true and wonderful. But this centre, you've got something particularly special in terms of hospitality, friendliness, warmth, generosity. So it's a real pleasure to be back. Yeah. So yes, Vanaraji said that she'd like me to talk about conditionality and karma. And downstairs, Vanaraji was talking about the Buddhist vision, And well, I was thinking that, in a way, any real vision, including the Buddhist vision, I think any real vision has to address the individual person and their life, and it has to address the bigger context that we find ourselves in. So I know for me that was, I wouldn't have articulated it like that, but I think from an early age I kind of had both those questions going on. One was sort of who am I and what should I do with my life, and particularly knowing that life ends. So I was saying last time, when I was 11, my dad died. So from a young age, I was aware that life was finite, it ended. And that ending, the knowledge that it would end, seemed to provoke this question of, so what should we do with life, with the time that we've got, given that we don't know what time we've got. And the answers that I saw around me of get a job, get a partner, get a house, go on holiday, none of that seemed adequate to the fact that here we are and we don't know how long we've got. None of that seemed adequate. But also I was interested in what's going on in that bigger context. What is the universe? What is this experience of the world? What's reality? What is it? And which, of course, then led me to study physics and trying to answer the questions about what reality is. And physics did help to some degree in that it had some big laws and sort of some big ideas. But physics wasn't going to tell me how to live my life. The question of what should I do with my life, given that here I am, physics doesn't have an answer for that. I thought that people that I met, physicists, scientists, they may have an answer. I thought that they may be wise, for example, and live through wisdom. But I was naive, and when I met these incredibly bright, talented people, as I got to know them, I realised that no, they were quite ordinary people. They didn't have the answers about what to live for either. So I think the Dharma, well, any real vision, and I think all religions probably try to answer this, is both those things. What's the nature of reality, and how do we live? What does it mean for me? Yeah? And the Dharma has a very, very simple and beautiful response to that. The Buddha, one of the things that the Buddha said is that his Dharma, his teaching, all led to freedom, to real freedom. You've probably heard this. In the Udana, there's a which is a collection of suttas there's a sutta where the Buddha says that just as the ocean, wherever you go in the world, the ocean has the same taste. It has the taste of salt. So whichever teaching of the Dharma you pick up, it'll have the same taste. Whether it's the mindfulness of breathing, the metta bhavana, whether it's tantric Buddhism, whether it's whatever it is, whichever aspect of the Buddha's teaching you pick up, it'll have the same taste, and that taste is the taste of freedom. And by freedom, the Buddha didn't just mean freedom to do what we like, which is the sort of freedom that I think we have. The idea of freedom in the West is very much seems to be associated with, well, I can do what I like, I can spend my money how I like, I can get the job I like, etc. He didn't mean that. He meant a freedom of consciousness from the constraints that bind us in our mind, that cause us pain, that cause us suffering. So this freedom was a freedom from all mind-made pain. Yeah? But his answer to, in a way, that personal freedom was also related to what the nature of reality is. Because this freedom comes when we perceive directly, intuitively, with insight, when we see what the nature of reality really is, what's really going on, how things really are. The freedom arises when we see how things are. So they're very linked. This personal freedom is linked to the truth in that bigger sense. Yeah. So then he was asked, of course, to say how are things? What is it that you realize enlightenment? And the Buddha said many things. But the most fundamental of his teaching, the teaching that Sangharakshita has pointed out underlies the whole of Buddhism, is this teaching of conditionality. And put baldly, the teaching doesn't sound very exciting. How it's sometimes phrased is that everything arises in dependence upon conditions. So everything from this cup of water to this leaf, to the flower, to this Buddha Rupa, to this evening, arises through conditions. And it disappears again when the conditions disappear. And that doesn't sound particularly exciting as a fundamental teaching until you examine it more closely. So I want to see if we can start to unpack that teaching. The teaching of karma is part of this unpacking, and we'll try and come on to it. Yeah. So let's just look at a phenomenon and see if we can trace back the conditions that led to it. So here we are on a Wednesday evening in January, in this room in mid-Essex, together. What are some of the conditions that have led to this evening happening now? I mean, this particular gathering with you here, me here. What are the conditions that have led to that? Anybody?
I'll start by saying the generosity of our Sangha.
The generosity of the Sangha.
Generosity in terms of, doing all sorts of things to make the centre possible.
Possible, yes. So to make this building possible. Yeah.
The website that let you see who was speaking.
Sorry?
The website that let you see who was speaking.
The website, that's right, that let you see who was speaking. Yeah, yeah.
People wanting to listen to you.
Right, so people wanting to listen to, presumably because they might have heard through the website or some other talks or whatever. Yeah.
Vision.
Go on, say more.
So the intention of creating a centre.
Yeah, the intentions of creating a centre. Yeah. So let's just explore that a little bit more. Whose vision was that?
Vanaraji is actually from Arizona.
Okay, so you've got Vanaraju, Pechati and Aryasara as this
Actually,
heroic triumvirate that had the vision to create the centre. Yeah? And I'm sure if I asked Vanaraju and Aryasara, they'd say it was a vision that they had caught from Bhante Sangharakshita, who would, if he were alive, say that he had caught that vision from his teachers, who would say that they had caught that vision all the way back up to the Buddha. Yeah, they'd caught this vision. The vision wasn't just from nowhere. It was, it had its. Sorry,
Progression.
it was a progression. It had its precedents. It had its conditions. Or to go back to the website, if we look at, yes, there was a website, an ad on the website that said I was speaking tonight. Well, what would you say the website was dependent upon? Where does a website? What does that rely on?
What, technically? Or,
Mm-hmm.
well, it relies
Possibly.
relies on the servers that run it.
Okay.
And the information that's been put on there by who runs the website.
So people who run the servers and the technology behind that and the information behind that, and you could go back in time and history in terms of the technology, and you could go back to who was it, Tim Berners-Lee, who invented the internet. You could go back to probably to I don't know.
Alan Turing.
Alan Turing, and who developed, who had the idea for computers, and before that, you could probably keep going back, probably to the Stone Age, when human beings first started to make tools. Yeah, somewhere there's a progression, there's a link. Yeah, but also, what brought you here? Well, each of you has come here because you're interested in the Dharma, through something in your life, or in meditation. Something has caught your interest. Something about meditation and Buddhism has caught your interest. And if I was to ask each of you, and of course we haven't got time, you'd have to look at your whole life to find out why you were interested, why you became interested in the Dharma. And that might involve your upbringing. That might involve books that you've read. That might involve experiences that you've had. All sorts of things. Sometimes even unpleasant experiences. A lot of unpleasant experiences sometimes lead people to the Dharma. It might involve how you were brought up, which of course then goes back to your parents. I mean, we wouldn't be here, of course, biologically and physically without our parents, but psychologically we're also conditioned by our upbringing, by our parents. We probably carry our parents around in our heads somewhere, don't we? Yeah. Each of us has a personal history that's led us here, including, of course, me. Then we've got lots of physical conditions for being here, like the fact that you live, probably most of us live in this area, or you could be in Manchester and you wouldn't have come to the Mid-Essex Centre. So what led you to live in this area? There's probably a whole network of things. All the people that you've met that have influenced you, that have led you to live here and be here and perhaps get interested in the Dharma. If you start tracing back your personal histories, you find a web of, there's no one cause, you would probably find a web of conditions that have led you to be here. Yeah, each of us. And then, of course, this combination of however many we are, that's a new combination. This combination will never be repeated again. So all of those conditions, Vanaraji's life, Sangajit's life, Aryasara's life, my life, have all had to come, and Sangharakshita's life, the Buddha's life, have all had to somehow come together to create this unique gathering right now. you could say you could trace the thing back to the birth of the universe. Somehow, if the sun wasn't there, or if our galaxy hadn't formed, none of us would be here. Do you see how a gathering like this, an event, actually any event, any phenomenon, is dependent upon an infinite number of conditions to precede it? Does that make sense? Buddhism says, often Western science talks in terms of cause and effect, like, I drop this and it falls to the floor, and physics can explain that. But Buddhism's more subtle than that. It says, look, it's not just that things happen because of one cause. There's a myriad of causes, a myriad of conditions, infinite conditions. I've just finished reading War and Peace, and Tolstoy understands this so deeply. So Tolstoy, who's read War and Peace? Has anybody read War and Peace? Okay, so I can make it up, actually. Oh, Vanaraji's read it. Okay, so I won't make it up. Tolstoy, he's talking about the Napoleonic Wars, and particularly the Napoleon's campaign in Russia, and the battles that happen there. And Tolstoy is very, very clear that when a battle is won or lost, historians say, oh, it was due to the generals or whoever was in command, their wonderful strategy. Napoleon's wonderful military genius led him to win this battle. And Tolstoy says, no. In a battle, every soldier fighting in the battle, every instinct that soldier has to fight or flee or fear, or every chance thing, even what their mood is like, what the weather's like, whether they feel hungry or not, every chance thing of every person involved, of the thousands of people involved in any one battle, leads to the outcome. He was saying sometimes it's complete from a big perspective. It feels random because there's so many tiny conditions involved. If a soldier feels like they're just going to charge forward when they shouldn't really charge forward because they might lose, that they're outnumbered. But if there's enough confidence in the charge, that can overturn the whole outcome of a battle. And he's saying that when historians look back, they don't know all those tiny conditions. So they just say, oh, Napoleon won because he had great strategy and foresight. So Tolstoy had an insight into how things arise. They arise because there's a myriad, an infinite number of individual conditions that lead to something happening. Yeah.
I'm a bit confused. If everything's conditioned, does that mean there's no free will?
Let me come on to that. So, can you hold fire on that? And I'll come back to that. Let's stay, first of all, to trying to understand that what Buddhism sort of sees is that any phenomenon is part of a web of conditions, and that phenomenon itself becomes a condition for future conditions, for future things to arise. So if you take, let's go right down to a flower and a plant. What are some of the conditions that lead to a plant growing? Sunlight. Water. Soil. Nutrients. A seed, that's right.
How they're taken care of. So
Say that again?
A human being involved in how they're taken care of.
Maybe how they're taken care of, whether they're looked after or not. Yep. So, and that's true moment to moment. So a plant, if it's living, will be exchanging light and water and air. It'll be interacting with its environment, the soil, all the time. Yeah, if it's a living plant, it'll be, even if it's a dead tree, it'll be decaying into the soil, and the air will be doing something, and the light and the heat and the moisture of the environment will be doing something. It's part of a web of interactions. That's the other way of looking at it. It's always in interaction with its environment. So when I say a flower or a plant, it's a bit of an abstraction. It's a bit of a simplification, because there's no real separation between this leaf and the air that's around it. I mean, it's breathing in. If it's alive, it will be breathing in carbon dioxide, as it were. It will be taking in light. It will be breathing out oxygen that then we're breathing in. Does that make sense? I mean, we know that. The Buddha didn't know all the science behind that, but we know that actually there's no real edges. Boundaries are artificial. There's no real edges. There's only interactions that are part of a web of flowing conditions and interactions. Yeah. But what our mind does is it can't handle all that complexity, just like the historians can't handle the complexity of what happens in a battle. Because you can't know every little condition. You'd go mad. We'd go mad trying to understand all the conditions that are leading to what's happening now. Yeah? We'd go mad. So what we do is we simplify things, and we just say, oh, this is a plant. We don't say, oh yes, it's a process that's also interacting with the air around it and the light around it, and we're somehow also in connection with it. We don't say all of those things. Just as the historian just says, oh, Napoleon won this battle. Yeah? It's a simplification, and it works at a common sense level, but Buddhism says that it's ultimately not true. And somehow this misjudgment, this misunderstanding, this delusion is connected to us not being free. This is why it's important. We're reading the world wrong, and that's keeping us bound. Yeah, that's keeping us bound. Now there's one more thing to say, and it might start to relate to your question, although the Buddha didn't really talk about free will, but I want to try and address it because I think it's an important question. There's one more thing to say. So the Buddha said that this whole phenomenal universe, everything that we can see and touch and experience, is just arising, is just a set of arisings of conditions. There are no real things, there are only processes, there are only events, and those events and processes have come into being through an infinite web of conditions, each one of them, and then as they arise, they condition other events and processes. There's just this web of conditionality, and that's what this phenomenal universe is. So that's one thing he said, and we're part of that. You know, our physical bodies are part of that, even our minds are part of that. But then the Buddha said that there's another realm, dimension, another possibility, which he talked about as the unconditioned. He talked about it as something in experience that isn't dependent on conditions, that is somehow outside of this realm that we call samsara. It's not in flux. It's not dependent on other things arising. It won't fade away. It's somehow eternal. Apart from eternal makes it sound like it's going to last forever. It's not even that. It's outside of this whole notion of time. There's something timeless that's possible for us to experience. And that is where the freedom lies. That's where our freedom lies. And he talked about it as nirvana or enlightenment, or sometimes he talked about it as the unconditioned realm. And in any other religion, freedom, that ultimate fulfillment, would be termed God, wouldn't it? It would be, God is outside of this world of pain. In Buddhism, there isn't this personal anthropomorphic God, but there is something beyond this mundane world that we can touch and feel and see and sense. There is something beyond this body. There is something even beyond our ordinary mind with its grasping and pushing and pulling and I want and I don't want, our self-centered mind. There is something beyond all of that. And that beyond, however you want to talk about it, is our own potential. It's you could say it's who we really are. You could say it's the true nature of our mind is not conditioned. It's somehow free. It always was free. And this realm, which isn't really a place because it's not in space, but we have to use language. I'm using language as metaphor now. It's when I say realm, you kind of think of something in space. It's not in space. It's not in time. It's not really within. It's not really without, because that's in space. But it is a possible human experience to touch and even inhabit this freedom. And because that's also part of who we are, that's where I think our point of freedom comes from. It's not we're not entirely conditioned. It's almost as if there's something in us that is beyond conditions. Sometimes we know that. Somewhere, a lot of the time I don't know that. A lot of the time I'm just operating on a sort of habitual autopilot mode. And most of that is a sort of self-centered way of being in the world that just wants what it wants, what I want. But sometimes I'm in touch with something that goes beyond that, and then it seems to go beyond who I even think of as me. And those experiences are moments when I feel connected with the world, with other people. There's a sense of beauty. There's a sense of freedom. There's a sense of love. There's a sense of meaning, but meaning that doesn't have a concept behind it. There's just a sense of, yes, this is true and right, an intuitive understanding. Do you have a sense of that? Have you had glimpses of, you could say they're peak experiences where life seems to make sense, and you feel connected, you feel alive, you feel like you're in touch with truth, and normally it's accompanied by something being beautiful, the world looking beautiful. Tolstoy again does this so well. He has his characters who, there's hundreds of characters in War and Peace. You really see their interconnectedness. You see their lives enmeshed in the lives of many others and in historical events as they unfold. He's describing conditionality. And then every so often, particularly with two of the characters, maybe more than two, but particularly with two of them, they have a sense of transcendence. One of them is lying on a battlefield dying. He's been wounded. And he looks up at the sky, and it's a clear blue sky. And he's dying. He's wounded. I mean, he's not dying immediately, but he will die from his wounds. And he feels the most alive that he's ever been. And he feels the most love that he's ever felt. And then when later on he's on his deathbed, He's with the love of his life. Natasha is with him. They've been estranged. They've come together. He's on his deathbed. She's with him. She's holding his hand, and she's fraught with despair that he's dying, and he's completely at peace. He's completely at peace. Death no longer is something to be feared. Even his love, Natasha, who he was obsessed with, that personal love doesn't mean anything to him anymore. He feels love for everybody. That this grasping personal love means nothing. His own life, he sees it in a huge context, and it's beautiful, and he's free. And death, he even smiles, and he smiles to himself and thinks, I wish I could explain this, but nobody will understand. And he dies in a transcendent peace. He achieves freedom before he dies. Now that Tolstoy understood, because Tolstoy wasn't a Buddhist, but because all human beings are capable of that. This is what the Buddha was pointing to, that you don't have to wait till you die. We can realise this freedom in our lives. We're not bound by this conditioned world entirely. And one of the ways, so now I want to move on to karma. One of the ways that we, in a way, an essential way that we can move towards freedom is by working with this natural law of karma. And karma is one specific way in which conditions unfold into consequences. It's one way. And it's a law that says that if I act from love and generosity and awareness, then generally there'll be beneficial consequences for myself and for others. And if I do the reverse, act from greed and hatred and blindness, then generally my mind will suffer sort of pain, and it'll cause more pain in the world. That's the law of karma. There's more to the law of karma than that. But that's the essence, that our intentions, our states of mind, govern how we act, and we create a world that is bigger and more beautiful and more loving, or one that's constricted and tighter and more painful. Yesterday I was watching, have you watched The Choir? Have you watched The Choir with Gareth Malone? Gareth Malone is this choir master, this sort of genius actually. He goes into places and teaches people to sing and forms choirs. And through forming choirs, he forms community. He forms Sangha in our context, yeah? Anyway, it's on BBC, on iPlayer. Have a look. He's going into a prison for young offenders, 18 to 21-year-olds, Aylesbury Prison. And the governor of the prison has asked him to come and form a choir. And he goes in, and these 18 to 21-year-old young men don't want to sing. They're not interested. They're in there for murder, for armed robbery, for all sorts of offences. I mean, too horrible to contemplate, some of them. They're tough. They have to have this tough persona, and it's a brutal environment in that prison. There's a fight almost every day, and people end up. There's gangs in the prison after each other. Anyway, he's like this, I don't know, small, effete, Oxbridge educated, probably posh guy, you know, into classical music, and they're not. And this meeting is extraordinary. He gets them to talk about themselves, and one after another, you hear them say, "Oh yeah, I did this, and I'm paying the consequences." I stabbed this person. I did an armed robbery. I did whatever I did, and I really regret it. I really regret it. I didn't know what I was doing. And one of them even says, prison is what I needed to teach me. It's very, very moving, very, very moving. And you could really see that these men, some of them, that the upbringing, the conditions of their life had led them to act in certain ways that then had had more consequences, that had led to their world shrinking more and more, literally shrinking, till some of them spent 23 hours a day in a cell on their own. That's the law of karma in a horrible way. And these men, who've never heard of karma probably, were talking about that. Yeah, they knew that their actions had had these consequences for them, and they'd hurt others in the process. And there was remorse, there was regret. What we can do as Dharma practitioners is use this law of karma to move us towards freedom. We've got the choice. Meditation, particularly meditation like the mindfulness and metta bhavana practice, help us have more of a choice. Meditation starts to, well, hopefully you've had this experience. Have you had this experience that as you meditate, you start to get to know your own motivations more? Does that make sense? Your own emotions more. Does that? Yeah. Like when I came to meditate, I kind of thought I didn't have much anger. I thought I was a nice guy. I started doing the metta bhavana and got all this anger, towards my mum, towards people I liked, towards my boss, all this anger. And it had always been there. It wasn't that the metta bhavana suddenly added on anger. It was more that I wasn't aware in the past of what my own motivations were. And now I was becoming more self-aware. So when we're more self-aware, then we can have a choice. Do we want to act from whatever's going on for us, or do we want to keep that in check? Yeah, that's the start of freedom. In Buddhism, ultimate freedom can't be in this conditioned world that we're in. We can't control everything that happens to us. But what our ultimate freedom is, our only real freedom, is how do I respond with my mind when something happens? When somebody is rude to me, I might not be able to control their behaviour, but how do I respond? That's my choice. Yeah, that's my ultimate freedom. So meditation helps us work with that. It creates a bit more freedom in our heads, in our minds, in our experience. The law of karma teaches us that if we act skillfully through awareness, kindness, generosity, then we can move ourselves towards a little bit more freedom. In the converse, we just dig grooves in our mind that go deeper and deeper and deeper till they become ruts, till they become trenches. And some of these men that I was watching on television last night, they were in ruts and the trenches. Gareth Malone was getting them to write their own songs because all they wanted to do was rap. They didn't want to sing. They couldn't sing, apart from one of them. Anyway, so he was saying, never mind. So write about your life. What would you want to say? And one man talked about, I'm in too deep. I want to be free. I'm in too deep. There's no way out. They've thrown away the key. I want to be free, and I'm in too deep. The ruts of our mind go deeper and deeper and deeper through our actions. Yeah. So law of karma provides a way out. Really, I wanted to say, oh God, these guys need to learn to meditate. Singing's great, but it only goes so far. They need to learn to meditate. Everybody needs to learn to meditate, I think, and learn to take responsibility for their own minds and actions. If we can do that, we can start to create a world for ourselves and for those around us that is more aligned with enlightenment. Now, it doesn't mean that the law of karma is going to get us to enlightenment overnight. It doesn't happen overnight. It's gradual. But we can get to a point where this unconditioned realm, which is represented by the Buddha here, by the Buddha there, by Padmasambhava there, by all the Buddhas surrounding us, they're symbols for this unconditioned realm, this enlightened realm, this enlightened mind. We can get to a point, through working on our karma, we can get to a point where that unconditioned realm can touch us, where it reaches down, as it were, to us, and it's a bit like grace. Something new will arise in our experience. Something new will come in that wasn't of this conditioned realm, that even the law of karma didn't do. It's beyond the law of karma. It's beyond everything that we know. But we're only going to be receptive to that touch of the Buddhas, that grace of the Buddhas, that enlightened light. We're only going to be receptive to that if our minds are clear enough, calm enough, receptive enough, open enough, positive enough, connected with other people enough. And that's only going to happen if we use the law of karma to work with our practice. Yeah? Otherwise, we'll probably miss it. Actually, this light from the Buddhas is shining down all the time. It's like the sun is shining behind, even though it's night now, somewhere the sun is shining on the other side of the earth. Even when it's cloudy, the sun is always shining, but the clouds don't allow us to see it. Well, in our own mind, normally there's clouds. They're the clouds of craving and hatred and delusion. The law of karma, by working with meditation and our ethics, the five precepts, by working with them, we start to thin the clouds. We start to thin them, and then the unconditioned, which is beyond this phenomenal world, something of that sometimes breaks through. And when it does, it'll be like you're lifted up, you're lit up. Something extraordinary has happened in your life. And even if you only glimpse it for a moment, as some of Tolstoy's characters do, your life is never the same again. It's like it will dissolve the fear of death, for example. So that's extraordinary. If we could live without being frightened of dying, I don't know, what would we do? It would lift. We wouldn't then be dependent on life going our way. Most of the time we're so concerned with making life work out for me, for you. Each of us is trying to get what I want, to be happy in this world. Well, if we were touched by the light of the enlightened mind, what happens in this world wouldn't matter, because we would be freer from that. So the worst thing that can happen in this world is sickness, death, pain, loss, all of that. Somehow we'd have risen above all of that. We wouldn't be, our equanimity wouldn't be shaken by the worst that this conditioned world can do, because we'd have found a deeper, higher experience of joy, of bliss, that was independent of conditions. So I want to let me just see if there's any. Maybe we've got time for one question, and I want to finish with something.
I was thinking about in terms of like climate change.
Yeah.
That in a way, if everything is, because the condition.
Yeah.
It
Yes.
felt like if I can get in touch with that, then I'm there's a freedom from fear of what's
Yes.
going to happen.
Yes.
But as human beings, we try and control it. So
That's right.
So all the news is full of how we're going to control it, but obviously we can't.
No, we can't. So, and yet we can't control. That's exactly right. We can't control. So climate change is happening because of a myriad different conditions, and we're seeing that. We're seeing the interconnected nature of all life on this planet, and how we're all affecting, and human beings are particularly adversely perhaps affecting the environment. We're not going to, any one of us, be able to control what happens. The situation's too complex for that, and most big issues are too complex. We can, however, have an influence, because we can act, we can be confident that even if the influence is tiny, we do have an influence. So I think that Buddhism says, look, whatever influence we can have in our lives, it's important to make that a positive influence. So let's try and have as positive an influence as we can. But yes, we won't be able to control. And therefore, part of what we're trying to learn is to let go of the fear, the anxiety, the despair that often goes with activism. People who sometimes are fighting for any cause, be that reversing the horrors of any situation. It's very easy to fall into despair and anxiety and righteous indignation or blame, all sorts of things. And Buddhism saying, no, that just traps us further. We can learn to let go of control, anxiety, fear, despair, all of those things, and still not go passive. Still not go passive and say, okay, well, what influence I will have in the world, I'm trying to make it a positive one. And then together, as a Sangha, we can do more. And I know our Sangha's tiny, but we can, there are lots of good people trying to do good things in the world, and we can be part of a network of people trying to do good. That's for me, what partly gives life meaning. That we're collectively trying to do some good in the world. And Buddhism says samsara will never be fixed. Yeah? Even if we were to reverse the damaging effects of climate change, we'd still die. There'd still be death. Yeah? So there has to be something beyond this conditioned world. So I want to finish with, I've gone on a little bit over time, I know, but I want to just finish with one of my favourite passages from a speech by David Foster Wallace that you might have heard me recite before or read before. And he's talking about real freedom. He's not a Buddhist. In fact, well, he's no longer alive. He died before his time. He was a genius, I think, an American writer, a genius. But he also suffered from depression, and he took his own life. This passage comes from an address that he gave to a bunch of students who were graduating from an American college. It's called a commencement speech because they're graduating, I guess they're commencing their adult life. And he's teaching them, I think, about the law of karma. He touches on, I think, more than the law of karma. He's also touching on something at the end which goes beyond anything that we can grasp or talked about, this infinite something that isn't in time and space, that is our own birthright, that somehow it's who we really are, and it's what this reality, this world, it really is. He touches on that. Okay, so I'll read you it. It's quite long, so just bear with me. Because here's something else that's true. In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshipping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And an outstanding reason for choosing some sort of spiritual thing to worship, be it Jesus Christ or Allah or Yahweh or the Wiccan Mother Goddess or the Four Noble Truths, that's the right one, or some infrangible set of ethical principles, the reason for choosing one of these is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough, never feel that you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally plant you. On one level, we all know this stuff already. It's been codified as myths and proverbs, cliches, epigrams, parables, the skeleton of every great story. The trick is to keep this truth up front in daily consciousness. Worship power, and you will feel weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power over others to keep that fear at bay. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart, you will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. Look, the insidious thing about these forms of worship is not that they're evil or sinful, it's that they are unconscious. They are the default settings. They're the kind of worship you gradually slip into day after day, getting more and more selective about what you see and how you measure value without ever being fully aware that that's what you're doing. And the world will not discourage you from its default settings, because the world of men and money and power hums along quite nicely on the fuel of fear and contempt and frustration and craving and the worship of self. Our own present culture has harnessed those forces in ways that have yielded extraordinary wealth and comfort and personal freedom. The freedom to be lords of our own tiny skull-sized kingdoms, alone at the centre of all creation. This kind of freedom has much to recommend it, but of course there are different kinds of freedom, and the kind that is most precious you will not hear much talked about in the great outside world of winning and achieving and displaying. The really important kind of freedom involves attention and awareness and discipline and effort and being able to truly care about other people and to sacrifice for them over and over in myriad petty little unsexy ways every day. That is real freedom. The alternative is unconsciousness, the default setting, the rat race, the constant gnawing sense of having had and lost some infinite thing. So with those words of David Foster Wallace, I'll leave it there and say thank you very much.